This video reveals one of the darkest and most tragic stories history tried to erase. If you want to uncover the pain buried beneath time, stay until the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Before Sparta became a name whispered in awe and fear, it was just a cluster of villages in the shadow of Mount Taygetus. The river Eurotas ran cold through the valley, and the hills carried the scent of iron and ash. Even then, something restless stirred in the hearts of its people, a hunger for perfection that would one day consume them. They believed weakness was a sickness, that mercy was rot, and that only the strong were meant to survive. When a child was born, there was no celebration, no laughter, no wine, no singing, only judgment. At sunrise, elders from the council, the Gerousia, gathered in a courtyard of stone. The air was cold enough to sting the skin. A mother stood trembling, holding her newborn to her chest. Behind her, soldiers waited, silent, unmoving. She prayed under her breath, not to be seen as weak. Her husband stood beside her, eyes fixed on the ground. He dared not look at her or the child. In Sparta, affection was a dangerous thing. The elder reached out, his hands marked with age and power. He lifted the infant by its ankles and turned it to the light. He looked for symmetry, for muscle tone, for the promise of future strength. If he found none, the decision was quick. The child would be taken away, carried to the base of Mount Taygetus, where the stones were sharp and the wind merciless. It was called the Apothetai, a place of abandonment, a place where imperfection went to die. Some say the mothers screamed. Others say they did not dare. Because in Sparta, tears were rebellion. Those who lived, the chosen, were marked from that moment forward. They were not children of parents, but of the state. The city owned their lives, their bodies, even their futures, and the mothers learned to live without tenderness. Their duty was to bear the next generation of soldiers, not sons. Spartan law was forged by a man named Lycurgus, a figure wrapped in myth and fear. He gave them the great retra, a code that stripped life of comfort and replaced it with obedience. Every law served one purpose, to build the perfect warrior. Every heartbeat belonged to Sparta. Homes were simple. Meals were meager. Luxury was outlawed. Even conversation was shaped by brevity. The world called it laconic speech. To speak less, to feel less, to need less, because to need was weakness. The city's rhythm was mechanical. Births, inspections, discards, drills. Every cry, every silence, every funeral, synchronized like the march of soldiers. Sparta had turned life into machinery, and yet, beneath the cold order of the city, there were whispers. Whispers of mothers who secretly named their lost children. Of fathers who pretended not to know the sound of their own son's cry. Whispers of hearts trying to survive under laws that forbade them to feel. Sparta was not born cruel, it became cruel by design. It believed that emotion weakened the blade of duty. That love clouded the eye of discipline, but in doing so, it created a nation of ghosts. Even as they built the world's strongest army, they were already tearing apart their own souls. The great historian Plutarch wrote that Spartan infants were bathed in wine to test their endurance. If the body convulsed, it was unworthy. If it endured, it was praised. And so began the life of the perfect Spartan. By age 7, the chosen boys would be taken from their families, thrust into the agage, the brutal training that molded them into soldiers. But that is a tale for another dawn. For now, remember the mothers, the first victims of perfection, their arms empty, their hearts silent, their names forgotten beneath the echo of shields. And somewhere in the cold wind of Taygetus, the cries of the abandoned still drift, a lullaby no one was meant to hear. When the sun rose over Sparta, it did not bring warmth. It brought duty. Every light that touched the city revealed another rule, another expectation, another sacrifice. By the time a boy turned 7, he was no longer his mother's child. He belonged to the agoge, the state's forge for warriors. He would not see his home again for years. No embraces, no softness, no voice whispering, "Be careful." His new home was discipline, a barrack filled with stone, sweat, and silence. The agog was not just training, it was transformation. Every lesson carved away another piece of humanity. Boys learned to steal food and endure hunger. They were beaten when caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to fail. Pain was their teacher. Fear was their companion. They were told to speak little, to sleep little, to feel nothing. And yet, every night when the torches died down, some whispered their mothers' names into the dark. That whisper was the last breath of their childhood. Sparta's vision of perfection went beyond its soldiers. It reached into every chamber, every marriage, every heart. Love in this city was not a gift. It was a calculation. The Spartan state controlled who could marry, when and why. The ephors, the overseers, decided pairings based on physical strength, not affection. A woman's beauty mattered only if it promised strong offspring. A man's kindness was meaningless unless his muscles spoke louder. Marriages were arranged like breeding programs. Two bodies chosen for their symmetry and vigor. They met under the eye of law, not the gaze of love. On their wedding night, the bride's hair would be cut short. She would wear a man's cloak and wait in darkness while her husband approached in secrecy. Even this act, something sacred in most of the world, was turned into ritual efficiency. Afterward, he would leave her and return to the barracks. He would see her only in secret, sometimes sneaking away under the cover of night. This was not romance. It was duty. If a man reached 30 without marrying, the punishment was humiliation. He would be forced to parade naked through the city in winter, singing a mocking song that confessed his disloyalty to Sparta. The message was clear. A man who did not breed for the state was a traitor to it. Love was weakness. Marriage was function. Desire was tolerated only as obedience. The system allowed even stranger customs. If a married man was deemed strong but childless, the state could order him to share his wife with another man. Likewise, a healthy woman could be sent to another husband if her current one was judged too old or frail. They called it pragmatism. They said it was for the strength of the next generation. But in truth, it stripped away the last refuge of human intimacy. Imagine the silence in those homes, a wife's eyes lowered as the council announced her pairing, a husband standing rigid, pretending it didn't break him. Even affection became a crime of the heart. The philosopher Xenophon once praised Spartan discipline, but even he admitted it left no space for tenderness. He wrote that Spartans married not out of love, but because the city demanded it. They belonged to duty before they ever belonged to each other. And in that duty, they lost something greater than freedom. They lost the right to feel. Yet not everyone obeyed in silence. In the shadows, rebellion still breathed, quiet, dangerous, human. Some couples fell in love beyond the state's design. They met in hidden places, near the olive groves or by the river. They whispered the words Sparta forbade. For them, love was not an act of pleasure. It was defiance. Each touch, each stolen moment, was a secret war against their own city. If discovered, the punishment was brutal: exile, disgrace, or death. But even fear could not erase the longing that lived in silence. Because no law, not even Sparta's, could fully extinguish the human need to be known. Still, the weight of obedience was heavy. The city's iron grip held generations captive, fathers training sons who would one day be stripped from them, mothers birthing children they would never raise, and lovers pretending their passion was only duty. This was the breaking point, not a single moment of violence, but a slow erosion of the human soul. The people of Sparta no longer knew what it meant to belong to one another. They belonged only to their city, a city that demanded everything and gave back only silence. Lycurgus's laws had achieved the impossible, a nation without weakness and a people without hearts. And in the dead of night, when even the soldiers slept, the walls of Sparta seemed to breathe, as if the city itself mourned what it had become. The mountains around Sparta stood like guards, cold, eternal, watching. But within their shadow, a different kind of darkness grew, one that no sunrise could cleanse. By now every boy in the agoge had become something else. Not a child, not yet a man, but a weapon still being sharpened. Their world was built on endurance, not mercy. Their instructors, older warriors hardened by war, did not teach compassion. They taught silence. They taught how to kill, quietly how to obey, without hesitation, and how to survive, without love. Each morning began before dawn. The boys rose to the sound of horns, their bare feet slapping the frozen ground, their breaths turning to mist in the air. They ran until their lungs burned, fought until blood covered their hands, and ate so little that hunger became a constant companion. When food ran out, they were told to steal, not to satisfy their hunger, but to sharpen their cunning. And when caught, they were beaten, not for the theft, but for failing to hide it well enough. Every scar was proof of devotion. Every bruise was a lesson. Every tear was weakness, and weakness had no place in Sparta. Imagine the heart of a child forced to bury his emotions before he even understood them. Imagine standing at 7 years old, watching your friend collapse from exhaustion, and being told not to help him because mercy was for cowards. That was the horror that unfolded behind the proud Spartan walls. They called it strength. But what it truly was the systematic destruction of the human spirit. Each boy was paired with an older mentor, a warrior who guided and watched him. These relationships were complex, sometimes cruel, sometimes disturbingly intimate. In many ways, the state blurred every boundary between affection and control. Plutarch wrote that these pairings were meant to instill courage and loyalty. But even he, centuries later, hinted at something darker, that in Sparta, the line between mentorship and possession was perilously thin. The boy's body was not his own. His mind was not his own. His life belonged to the city. At 12, he was given only one garment to last the entire year. He slept outdoors in the cold, his thin cloak stiff with frost by morning. They said the cold would teach endurance. They said the pain would teach strength. But no one spoke of what it taught the soul, the quiet numbness that crept in, the emptiness that followed him long after his victories. By the time he reached 15, his smile was gone, his laughter a memory. He could break bones but not cry. He could survive anything except tenderness. And yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire burned low and the instructors slept, you could hear the faintest sound. A whisper, a trembling breath, a sob stifled in the dark. Those were the moments when the children of Sparta remembered that they were still human, moments the city would never allow in daylight. Because if you remembered how to feel, you might one day remember how to rebel. For the girls of Sparta, the story was no softer. They too were molded, not into mothers first, but into strong vessels for the next generation of warriors. They wrestled, ran, and trained beside the boys. Their strength was celebrated, but only for one reason: it promised strong sons. Even in their triumph, their worth was measured by the lives they could produce, not the ones they lived themselves. They were told that to die in childbirth was as glorious as a man dying on the battlefield, that their screams in labor were equal to a warrior's cry in war. It was honor, yes, but it was also enslavement, wrapped in the silk of patriotism. The horror of Sparta was not only in its cruelty, it was in how deeply its people believed in it, how they wore their pain like armor and mistook obedience for pride. To question the system was treason. To long for comfort was weakness. To love too deeply was to betray the state. And so, generation after generation, Sparta bred warriors without compassion, mothers without tenderness, citizens without hearts. But beneath this machinery of control, the human soul fought to breathe. A glance shared between forbidden lovers, a soldier secretly sparing an enemy's life, a mother slipping food to her starving child. Each act, tiny, defiant, was a reminder that even the most disciplined cruelty could never kill humanity completely. The horror unfolded, yes, but so did resistance, quiet, invisible, and immortal. Sparta's walls were strong, its warriors unmatched, its enemies terrified. But its people lived in shadows, shadows cast by their own greatness. For what is the price of perfection if you must lose your soul to pay it? In the heart of Sparta, that was the question no one dared to ask aloud, because even to speak it was to remember what it meant to be human. They called him the hoplite, the shield bearer, the perfect soldier. But what they really made was a man who no longer remembered what it meant to feel. By 20, a Spartan boy was no longer a boy. He had no home, not in the way we understand it. He lived in the barracks, slept on reeds, and called his brothers family. The syssitia, the communal mess, was his life. Every meal, every laugh, every whisper of strategy happened there, beneath the torchlight. Even marriage, when it came, was an act controlled by the state. He could not live with his wife, not yet. Only sneak away at night, like a thief in his own city. Imagine this: you have a wife, chosen by decree, a woman you barely know, whose body is not hers, and whose love must remain silent. You visit her in secret, not out of romance, but because the law demands you to produce sons. And when you return to your barracks before dawn, you are praised not for love, but for obedience. In Sparta, even affection was a form of discipline. The Spartan army was unmatched. A single phalanx could hold 1,000 men at bay. Each soldier knew exactly where to stand, when to strike, and when to die. Their shields were round and heavy, not just protection, but a symbol of unity. A Spartan mother would hand her son his shield and say, "With it, or on it, return victorious or return dead." There was no third option, because in Sparta, survival without honor was worse than death itself. At 30, he was finally allowed to live with his wife. But by then, the bond of tenderness had long since faded. The years of silence had hardened him, and his wife, too, had learned not to expect warmth. Their union was one of duty, not devotion. Their children, offerings to the state. And yet sometimes, behind closed doors in those fleeting moments before dawn, the mask would slip. He would hold his child, awkwardly, almost afraid, and whisper words he'd never dare speak in daylight. Be strong, but be kind. Words that no Spartan teacher would ever forgive. In battle, he was unstoppable. In peace, he was hollow. The hoplite formation, a perfect wall of shields and spears, was the embodiment of the Spartan soul, tight, unyielding, faceless. Each man trusted the one beside him more than himself. But in that unity, individuality disappeared. He was no longer a person. He was a piece of a machine. They didn't fight for glory. They fought because they were made to. When foreign visitors came to Sparta, they saw the discipline, the beauty, the strength. They wrote of the gleaming spears, the proud marches, the city without crime or corruption. But none wrote of what they didn't see. The tears that never fell, the families torn apart by law, the lives lived in silence. They saw the perfect soldier, but never the broken man inside. Aristotle once called Sparta a nation of slaves, not because of the helots they ruled, but because the Spartans themselves were enslaved to their own system. They belonged to the state from birth to death. Every breath served one purpose, the preservation of military perfection, and in that pursuit they destroyed everything that made life worth fighting for. Love became duty, marriage became strategy, even death became theater. A Spartan mother who cried for her dead son was shamed. A widow who mourned too long was whispered about in the market. So they learned to smile through the pain, to stand straight at funerals, to bury emotion as deeply as they buried their dead. They were the perfect soldiers, and the most broken of men. Yet for all its cruelty, the system worked, for a time. The name Sparta became legend. At Thermopylae, 300 men held back an empire. Their courage was unmatched, their deaths immortalized. But behind the legend lay centuries of indoctrination, breeding, and quiet despair. They were not born heroes. They were made into them, piece by piece, tier by tier, until there was nothing left but obedience. When the wars ended and peace crept in like an unfamiliar guest, many Spartans no longer knew how to live. They had spent their entire lives learning how to die, and in that silence, the cracks began to show. Men wandered the agora like ghosts, seeking purpose in a world that no longer demanded their sacrifice. Women, widowed by endless wars, raised sons they knew would one day be taken from them. Sparta was still strong, but its soul was gone. He was the perfect soldier, unbreakable, disciplined, proud. But in his eyes was something deeper, a flicker of what once was human. And sometimes, when he stood alone on the mountainside, watching the sun bleed over the horizon, he would feel it, just for a moment. That ache he'd been trained to forget. The ache of a man who remembered what it meant to love, because even the perfect soldier cannot kill his own heart forever. The wars ended. The heroes returned, but Sparta was not the same. The land that once echoed with the sound of shields and marching feet was now silent, and in that silence, something sacred began to die. The great city still stood, its stone walls glowing beneath the sun, its banners snapping in the dry wind. But beneath the marble and bronze, the foundations had begun to crack. The men who came home from war were no longer warriors, only survivors. And the system that had built them did not know what to do with peace. For in a place that worshipped death, living became the hardest battle of all. The Agoga still trained boys to kill. The Sicea still gathered men in ritual meals. The laws of Lycurgus still ruled every breath. But something had shifted. The faith was gone, the obedience now hollow. Whispers filled the barracks. Why fight when there were no enemies left? Why serve when the gods themselves were silent? No one dared to ask aloud, but everyone felt it. The women, too, began to change. For centuries they had borne the weight of Sparta's vision, raising sons to die, bearing daughters destined for silence. Now, with the wars ending, they began to see the cost. They walked through the streets lined with widows, each face a mirror of grief. The songs they once sang to celebrate victory now sounded like lullabies for the dead. And for the first time, the mothers of Sparta began to wonder, had they been brave or merely broken? Sparta's strength had always come from its people, not its numbers, but its unity. Yet over time, its population began to fall. The endless wars, the rigid breeding laws, the rejection of the weak, it all led to one outcome. There were simply not enough Spartans left to sustain Sparta. By the 4th century BCE, their armies had shrunk, their fields lay barren, and their walls, once unneeded, now guarded ghosts. The once proud warriors turned inward, guarding their traditions like ashes of a dying fire. They banned luxury, outlawed gold, and shunned foreign ideas. But what they couldn't ban was decay. The Helots, the enslaved people who farmed the land, began to grow restless. For generations they had endured whips and humiliation, but now they outnumbered their masters 100 to 1. When the Helots rose in rebellion, the Spartan army crushed them. But the victory was empty. Each revolt left Sparta weaker. Each punishment bled the land of its spirit. The city that once prided itself on simplicity had become a relic of its own ideals. Athens flourished in art and philosophy. Corinth traded in wealth and beauty. But Sparta clung to its silence, as if afraid that speaking would make its fragility real. The temples were still tended, the altars still burning, but even the gods seemed distant. Perhaps they, too, had grown tired of the endless sacrifices. History tells us that the Spartan kings continued their rituals. Their councils still debated in whispers, and their warriors still trained with precision. But the truth was more tragic. The men who stood in line with their shields no longer believed in what they were protecting. Their eyes were empty, their hearts already buried in the graves of their fathers. A nation cannot live without faith, and Sparta's faith was gone. There were still moments of pride, brief flickering flames in the darkness. When King Agesilaus led his men abroad, his brilliance reminded the world of what Sparta once was. But even he returned to a homeland that was fading, a city that could no longer remember why it fought. The laws of Lycurgus had created gods of war, but not men who could survive peace. They had conquered their enemies, but lost themselves. As the years passed, Sparta's sons dwindled to dozen. The women who once sang of victory now prayed simply for survival. The iron discipline that had once been strength became a chain, and the silence that had once been sacred became a tomb. You could walk through the streets of Sparta and hear only the wind, the sound of history breathing its last. Once they believed their gods watched over them. Once they believed their dead lived on in glory. But in the end, even the gods turned away. No temples could save them. No laws could protect them. And no warrior, no matter how perfect, could fight the passage of time. The silence of Sparta became the silence of the gods, and history closed its eyes. Time buried Sparta in dust. The temples crumbled. The voices faded. But the legend survived. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all. For centuries, poets and historians spoke of Sparta as the cradle of discipline, the model of strength. They wrote of the warriors at Thermopylae, their shields gleaming beneath the sun, their final stand against the impossible. They called it bravery. They called it glory. But they did not speak of the cost. They remembered the legend and forgot the people. The world remembered the soldiers, but not the mothers who wept in silence. The victories, but not the screams that built them. The discipline, but not the despair. History polished Sparta into marble, a monument to strength without mercy. But marble does not bleed. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Rome admired Sparta. Modern nations studied it. Generals quoted its codes. Leaders envied its unity. Even in the modern age, its ghost walks among us. Whenever a society worships power over compassion, obedience over truth, discipline over humanity, Sparta never died. It simply changed its name. In the museums of Europe, you can still see the relics, helmets, shields, weapons of bronze and iron. They sit beneath glass, perfectly lit, perfectly silent. But if you look closely, you might see the reflection of something else. Not glory, not pride, but emptiness. The emptiness left by centuries of silence. Plutarch once wrote that Sparta's strength was her law. He was right. But laws cannot love. Laws cannot forgive. And when the laws outlive the hearts that created them, only ghosts remain to keep them. That is what happened to Sparta, a civilization that built itself upon perfection and collapsed beneath its own ideals. They sought immortality through strength and found only extinction through control. But still, their shadow lingers. Each time a child is told to hide his tears, each time compassion is called weakness, each time humanity is sacrificed for duty, Sparta breathes again, not in the mountains of Greece, but in the corners of every heart that forgets what it means to feel. History remembers their victories, but memory remembers their pain. For behind every myth of greatness, there are faces we never see, names we never learn, lives erased to build the legend. Sparta's tragedy is not just ancient, it is eternal, because every empire that glorifies obedience will one day look into the same mirror and see what Sparta saw at the end, a reflection with no soul. Yet perhaps this is why their story must be told, not to glorify them, not to condemn them, but to remember them as humans, not symbols. Humans who loved, feared, hoped, and suffered. Humans who were taught to forget their own hearts, but whose pain still echoes through time. In the dust of ancient ruins, beneath the broken stones and forgotten prayers, the wind still carries their voices. They do not cry for victory. They do not cry for freedom. They cried to be remembered, as they truly were. Not gods, not monsters, just people, lost between the two. This was Sparta, and this was the price of perfection.